Thinking in English now has a Patreon. If you love listening to my podcast and you want to help and support the podcast to grow, please consider subscribing. We run weekly conversation clubs exclusive to Patreon subscribers where you can practice speaking with other learners and other native ESL tutors. They take place every Tuesday at 12 p.m. and 6 p.m. UK time, so work out your own time zones. There's also bonus episodes, one-on-one classes with myself, and much more. So click the link in the description or head over to patreon.com/thinking in English. Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. On October 30th, the people of Brazil will decide the next president of the country. The election could have major consequences for Brazil and the entire South American region. Today, let's discuss how elections work in Brazil, the background of the two candidates, and some of the major issues during this year's competition. And we can learn some useful vocabulary and practice talking about Brazil's elections. You can find the full transcript for free over on the Thinking in English blog. Head over to my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, for more great content, and leave a like, review, or rating wherever you are listening right now. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast and also on my blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. Incumbent. Incumbent. Having a particular official position. For example, the incumbent president of the US is Joe Biden. Corruption. Corruption. Illegal, bad, or dishonest behaviour, especially by people in positions of power. As in, political corruption is widespread throughout the country. Opposition. Opposition. Elected politicians who belong to the largest political party or movement not in government. As in, the opposition candidate is currently leading the polls. Campaign. Campaign. A planned group of political, business, military activities that are intended to achieve a particular aim. For example, he became famous for his campaign against building a new airport. Money laundering. Money laundering. The crime of moving illegal money through banks or businesses to make it look like legal money. For instance, he was convicted of money laundering 4 years ago. Law and order. Law and order. The introduction of laws and their strict enforcement by the police and courts. As in, he described himself as a law and order politician. Misogynist. Misogynist. A man who hates women. For example, his critics described him as a misogynist. Deforestation. Deforestation. The cutting down of trees in a large area or the destruction of forests by people. For example, deforestation is destroying large areas of the Amazon rainforest. Brazil is currently in the middle of a national election. On the one side, the incumbent president Jair Bolsonaro, a politician with a passionate fan base of right-wing Brazilians. Bolsonaro has pushed Brazil into cutting down the Amazon rainforest, has repeated many conspiracy theories, reformed the country's pension system, and has a controversial approach to government. On the other side, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, or Lula for short, a left-wing politician who was Brazilian president from 2003 until 2010. Lula was incredibly popular during his first terms as president, with an 80% approval rating. But he spent a year and a half in prison over a massive corruption scandal, which has damaged his reputation. Thinking in English has a lot of Brazilian listeners, and I have received so many requests and messages to do an episode on Brazilian politics. Interestingly, my audience seems to be incredibly divided. There are a lot of Lula supporters and a lot of Bolsonaro supporters among the people listening today. And, of course, there are many more of you from other countries around the world. So, today I want to introduce the Brazilian election to all of you. We'll learn some useful political vocabulary, practice talking about elections, and develop our understandings of Brazil. Of course, I am not Brazilian, and I'm not an expert in Brazilian politics. So I would love your input and your ideas. Please leave comments on the transcript on Spotify or on Instagram, and tell me, kindly if possible, why you disagree with me or why you agree with what I'm going to say today. The first thing to make clear is that Brazil has a presidential style of government, or to use the official description, a federal presidential constitutional republic. That's a little confusing, but in other words, Brazil has no king, queen, or emperor, but instead a president who is the head of the country. They have a constitution on which law is based, and the country is federal, meaning that power is divided and spread to different regions, called states in Brazil. Brazil has a 2-round voting system for the president. While some of you may be familiar with this kind of electoral system, I guess many of you come from countries like me, in which you only need to vote once. In Brazil, however, citizens need to vote twice. In the first round of voting, there are multiple different candidates and different parties, all running for election. Once votes have been counted, 2 things are possible. If no one single candidate receives 50% of the vote, then there is a second round of voting. In this second round, only the top 2 candidates from the first round can take place. However, if a candidate receives over 50% of votes in the first round, they become the president without needing another vote. This is rare, but Fernando Henrique Cardoso managed to do this twice in the 1990s. The first round of voting in the 2022 Brazilian presidential election took place on Sunday, 2nd of October. Around 10 different candidates took part, and no one single person received 50% of the votes. The top 2 candidates, former President Lula and current President Bolsonaro, will now take part in the second round of the election. This is scheduled for this weekend, Sunday 30th of October. According to the results of the first election, the opposition candidate Lula is currently ahead. He received around 48% of the national vote, while the incumbent Bolsonaro received around 43%. Although losing, this was actually quite a good result for Bolsonaro. He performed a lot better than expected. Some polls and surveys in Brazil suggested Lula was up to 14% more popular than Bolsonaro. In reality, the difference was just 5%. And polls are looking much closer for the second round of the voting. As of the time of writing, Lula is predicted to get around 52% of the vote, while Bolsonaro is expected to get around 48%. But every day, this number is getting closer and closer. The two candidates are now battling to persuade millions of Brazilians to switch their votes. But who are Lula and Bolsonaro? Let's start with Lula, the person currently leading the race to be the next president of Brazil. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was Brazilian president from 2003 until 2010, and is currently leading the race to become the next president of the South American country. After working a variety of jobs, including shining shoes, to support his family as a child, Lula began working at the Vilaras Metalworks in Sao Paulo. He joined the Metalworkers Union and began to work for the union full-time in 1972, serving as the legal officer and then union president. He gained national attention for campaigning for wage increases, a campaign he was arrested over and sentenced to 3.5 years in jail. After being released, he led the national campaign for democratic presidential elections and was elected as a politician for Sao Paulo in 1986. After running for president a few times and losing, he made changes to his approach in 2002. While still aiming to encourage normal people to become involved in politics, he also promised to work with businesses and the International Monetary Fund. In the 2002 election, Lula won with 61.5% of the vote. As president, Lula's aims included ending corruption, we'll talk more about this later, social reforms, and helping the economy. Despite the economy growing and poverty rate falling by the 2006 election, Lula was still criticized for not doing enough to improve education. Also, the first of many corruption scandals hurt Lula in 2005. Although he was not directly involved, the involvement of members of his party hurt his reputation. After winning the election in 2006, Brazil's future was looking good. The economy was continuing to grow, Rio de Janeiro was given the 2016 Olympic Games, and new oil was discovered. While Lula was unable to run for a third consecutive term as president, he chose his close advisor, Dilma Rousseff, to run in the next election. She successfully won that election and became Brazil's first female president. Lula was widely considered as one of the most popular presidents in the world. He helped millions of poor Brazilians leave poverty and developed successful social welfare programs. However, after leaving office, Lula and his successor Rousseff were deeply involved in scandal. Brazil's massive oil company Petrobras, members of Lula's Workers' Party, and Brazilian corporations were found to be involved in a major corruption, bribery, and kickback scandal. In March 2016, Lula was charged with money laundering and hiding his ownership of luxury apartments. President Rousseff tried to appoint Lula as her chief of staff, but this was blocked, as government officials cannot be charged by federal police. Rousseff was widely seen as trying to protect Lula. Rousseff was impeached and removed from office after being convicted of corruption due to misusing national money. Lula was facing numerous different criminal cases surrounding the Petrobras scandal, and in 2017, Lula was found guilty of corruption and money laundering and sentenced to 10 years in prison, which was later increased to 12 years. After initially refusing to surrender to police to start his jail term, Lula eventually travelled to prison to begin his sentence. With Lula unable to run in the 2018 election, due to being in prison, Jair Bolsonaro, who I'll talk about soon, was able to win that election. In 2019, Lula was found guilty in another corruption case, but in March 2021, the Brazilian Supreme Court ruled that Lula should never have been tried for corruption. All of the charges against him were dismissed, and while there are still other corruption cases ongoing against Lula right now, he was eligible to run for president again. On the other side, there is Jair Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is currently the president of Brazil. He was elected in October 2018, and his politics can be described as right-wing nationalist and law and order based. Brazil has struggled with corruption for decades, but large scandals involving presidents and senior politicians caused a lot of anger in the country. The Petrobras scandal in particular ruined the reputation of many Brazilian officials. Bolsonaro was elected during a wave of anger and discontent at the country's politics. He was seen as different and promised strict laws, punishments for corruption, and to bring respect and power back to Brazil. Bolsonaro was educated at military academies and served in the army for 17 years. A lot of comments I've received from Brazilian listeners describe Bolsonaro as a military man. During his time as a national politician representing Rio, he regularly praised Brazil's time under military dictatorship and wanted it to return. As a normal politician, Bolsonaro gained a controversial reputation. He was deeply conservative on social issues, opposing rights for minorities. His critics described him as being a misogynist and a racist. And he gained a reputation as being a little bit too extreme. And for most of his time as a politician, he was prevented from doing anything meaningful. However, during economic, social, and political crises, politicians with extreme ideologies can become popular. Think of the election of Donald Trump, Brexit in the UK, conservative governments around the world in Poland and Hungary and the Philippines, and much more. In 2014, Brazil entered one of the worst recessions in the country's history. At the same time, the largest political corruption scandal in Brazilian politics, the Petrobras scandal, was revealed. President Rousseff was impeached and removed from her presidency, and her successor, Michel Temer, was accused of corruption as well. And former President Lula was convicted of corruption and money laundering in 2017. Bolsonaro took the opportunity to run for president in 2018 and campaigned against the corruption and actions of major politicians. A lot of his characteristics remind me of Donald Trump. He was even described as the Trump of the tropics. He portrayed himself as an outsider, as different to other politicians. He said what he wanted and he didn't care if it upset or offended people. He supported tough law and order policies, and this appealed to Brazilians concerned about rising crime. And he supported conservative policies against gay rights and abortion rights, and this appealed to the growing number of evangelical Christians in Brazil. Bolsonaro was actually stabbed while campaigning in 2018 and had to do much of his work from hospital. But due to his strong social media presence and the unpopularity of his rivals, Bolsonaro achieved 55% of the national vote during the 2018 election. As president, Bolsonaro achieved his goal of restructuring the Brazilian pension scheme. 40% of national government spending was funding this incredibly generous pension. To cut spending, the minimum retirement ages for men and women were raised by 9 years to 65 and 62 respectively. Previous presidents had wanted to do this but had been unable to do so. However, many of his other actions as president have been controversial. Bolsonaro supports the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest. He reduced the power of government environmental agencies and ignored illegal logging activities. Bolsonaro also had a controversial response to the COVID-19 pandemic. He repeated conspiracy theories about the virus, ignored international and scientific medical advice, and laughed at people wearing masks. And in the last few months, Bolsonaro has been claiming that Brazil's electoral system is weak and vulnerable to be hacked. There are fears that he will not accept defeat if Lula wins on October 30th, just like Donald Trump in 2020. So, why does this election matter? Well, the biggest consequence of the Brazilian election will be to the economy. Despite Bolsonaro's statements that Brazil's economy is healthy, in reality growth is poor and, like the rest of the world, inflation is a major problem. Bolsonaro's government has also struggled to deal with the economic consequences of the global pandemic and of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Moreover, Brazil has the highest COVID death rate in the world. In other South American countries like Chile and Colombia, politics has become significantly more left-wing, and the same thing could happen in Brazil this year. Bolsonaro has shown no respect for the environment, and this has gained him major support among farmers, businesses, and people in rural states. He has weakened the protections for the Amazon, and forest fires are at record levels, caused by farmers burning down massive areas of the rainforest, and deforestation is at the highest level for 15 years. Damaging the Amazon, which is the largest absorber of carbon in the world, has a major consequence to the global environment, Brazil's neighbours, and also the indigenous people who live there. Lula has promised to protect the Amazon and reduce deforestation if elected. You may notice similarities between Bolsonaro and Donald Trump. Both are right-wing conservatives, both were elected as outsiders promising to end corruption, and both have had numerous controversial policies. There are fears that Bolsonaro could also copy Trump in denying the election result if he loses. Bolsonaro has claimed that if he loses, it will be due to election fraud. But there is no evidence for this, and Brazil has never experienced widespread election fraud since the current method was introduced in 1996. He has also said the military should monitor the election, something that has made many Brazilians uncomfortable. So here is today's final thought. We will know the outcome of the Brazilian election after voting finishes on October 30th. Brazil's electronic voting system is very fast, meaning results could be known almost immediately. I know I have a lot of Brazilian listeners, and I know many of my listeners are divided over this election. In fact, according to The Economist, earlier this year, nearly 40% of Brazilians didn't want either Bolsonaro or Lula as president. There is a choice between a right-wing, kind of anti-democratic, anti-environment Bolsonaro or Lula, who has spent time in prison for corruption and been involved in numerous other corruption scandals. It seems like a tough choice for me. Lula is still the favourite to win this election, but many of Bolsonaro's supporters are convinced he will win. And many Brazilians are fearing possible violence over their political views or the result of the election. All I hope is that the election is peaceful, that the result is accepted, and that Brazil can move forward, fix its economic problems, and stop with corruption. But what do you think? Who would you vote for, Bolsonaro or Lula? What is your country's politics like? Is it as divided as in Brazil? Let me know your ideas and comments by leaving a comment on the blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. The link to the transcript is in the description. Or you can leave a comment on Spotify if you listen on Spotify. or send me a message on Instagram. Please only send me kind messages. I don't want any angry messages about Bolsonaro or Lula, please. And if you love listening to Thinking in English, please consider leaving a rating on Spotify. We're at 3,100 5-star ratings. Hopefully we can get to 4,000 by Christmas. Or leave a review on Apple. I don't have that many Apple reviews, so I'd really appreciate if you listen on Apple, go and leave me a review over there. And if you love listening to Thinking in English, please consider subscribing to the Patreon as well. Patreon allows you to support me in making this podcast, and in return you can join our conversation clubs, get extra bonus episodes, and even have one-to-one conversations with myself. So that's patreon.com/Thinking in English, or the link is on my blog or in the description of the podcast. But thank you all so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.